Na ez, az van, hogy hát nem töltöttem le a játékot, úgyhogy még tölti. Úgyhogy van még 10 perc. Addig megnézzünk egy videót. Hiba. Már itt van valami Dark and Darker-es, hát nem tudom mi ez, hír, news.
Test on the 14th of April. Yeah, so there doesn't seem like there's ever really a slow news day lately. I guess it's good for making YouTube content anyway. But there has been a couple of new developments with the Iron Mace versus Nexon thing and all things related to Dark and Darker. There is a looming question mark over the heads of just about everyone insofar as whether or not we're actually going to see the next playtest on the 14th of April. All things considered, with how the timelines of this stuff works, and I guess we can talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but no, in my heart of hearts, I do not believe that we are going to see it. They haven't actually come out and said anything officially yet, but if we look at the timeline, I don't really think that's a possibility, at least not by the 14th. And there's a few reasons for this, but I'll show them to you in a little bit, I guess. Secondarily, there was also a really good, really well-researched Reddit post that goes into prior case law and whatnot over this DMCA claim that was made by Nexon against Iron Mace. Now, to reiterate, the way that DMCA works, anyone can make a DMCA claim if they believe that they have enough proof. A platform like Valve's Steam Marketplace has to take down anything if it believes the, allegations to be valid enough. And the reason for that is because they have to try to reside within what is known as a safe harbor provision that would prevent Steam from being held liable for leaving it up. Basically, if Iron Mace was found to be in breach of copyright and Valve didn't take it down prior to that, then Nexon could actually rope Steam into a lawsuit. They could sue Valve for having left it up and allowed it to continue. And obviously, Steam and Valve don't want that, so they have to protect themselves. That's why it was taken down. It doesn't actually prove innocence or guilt. It's just part of the process. But there was also this really well-researched post that was made on Reddit by somebody that is a research student, a law student, that also has had a prior profession working in the video games business as a game developer. So they offer a bit of a unique perspective here that I think is important to recognize, and they go into some really good stuff. Now, there are a couple of pieces here that I do disagree with, and I have examples as to why I disagree with them, but we can get to that in a minute as well. And lastly, there's another interesting piece where today, on all days, on the 2nd of April, there was an update made to the listing inside of Steam for Dark and Darker. Even though we can't see it, there's a log that was changed on the Steam Marketplace. If you go and check SteamDB, there was something modified in the launch executable for Dark and Darker. And I think that that's important to make note of because it could point to something, or it could point to nothing. But I guess that's why we talk about this stuff, right? Okay, so first, when people talk about the lawsuits between Nexon and Iron Mace, there's only two suits, actually. People think that there are a pair of suits in Korea that have to do with the DMCA claim in the United States and a separate lawsuit in Korea against Iron Mace for this whole trade secret thing. That actually isn't true. There are two lawsuits, but the one in Korea, at least insofar as right now, is a personal one between Nexon and this Mr. Choi, the person that was the creative director, the guy in charge of the team making Project P3 over at Nexon. When they left, that's when the lawsuit proceedings began, and Nexon just sued or accused Mr. Choi of all of this stuff. Now, that is a criminal matter in Korea, and we don't know whenever that's going to happen. But in Korea, there is no lawsuit, at least as far as I know, right now, between Nexon and Iron Mace. And I think that's an important distinction because the company versus company stuff is only going on in the United States, and it's about United States copyright law. See, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, is a U.S. law. That means that if you're going to invoke a U.S. law, you have to litigate it in the United States per United States laws. So when it comes to violating trade secrets and all of that stuff doesn't have anything to do with Korea insofar as whether or not Iron Mace can continue to make their game. It's whether or not they can actually do anything with the stuff that they've made already in the U.S. on Steam's marketplace place because the marketplace that is offering it up for sale is in the United States, and they invoked United States copyright law in order to get them to stop. There is also a cease and desist letter that has been sent to
Hát, hogyha ez így van, ez mindent
to
megváltoztat.
stop creating their
Mint
game.
amit sokan
But that cease and
spekuláltak, nem?
desist, that C&D, as far as I am aware, is one where Nexon threatened suit. They didn't actually get a court order from any court anywhere to enforce that and tell them that they must stop. So again, there isn't anything in place that says that Iron Mace Games has to stop the process of creating their game. It's really just a matter of whether or not they're going to be able to distribute it to anybody. And that's where the US law stuff comes in. Now, this user, Twig1554, ended up making this post 4 days ago, looking at the statements that were made in the DMCA filing of Nexon and trying to keep in mind a law, which is this serial number or this catalog number of PepsiCo versus Redmond. Now, this read is actually a really good one, and I would encourage you guys to all go and check it out. But throughout here, they reference case law and each one of the points that Nexon is trying to make all the way down through, and then references this PepsiCo versus Redmond case where Redmond was an employee of PepsiCo and was looking to leave to go and work for a competitor, and was ultimately ruled that Redmond could not do that because he had knowledge of certain procedures that had taken place inside of Pepsi that otherwise would give his competitor too much information about the processes that Pepsi did in making their soft drink. They even went so far as to say unless he possessed some uncanny amount of knowledge to compartmentalize the things that he knew versus things that he didn't, which obviously no human being has the ability to really do that. You can't just forget the things that you've learned when you've worked for a certain place. And that law is the one that is most closely related to this issue between Nexon and Iron Mace. He then goes on to talk about what trade secret law is being referenced, a very specific term defined in 18 USC 1839. The trade secret means all forms and types of financial, business, scientific, technical, economic, or engineering information, including patterns, plans, compilations, program devices, etc., etc., etc. Now, even if it's stored in personal, memorized physically in your own brain, and the way that it's determined to be a trade secret is if the owner thereof has taken responsible measures to keep such information secret and the information derives independent economic value, actual economic value, or potential economic value from not being generally known to and not being readily ascertainable through proper means by another person who can obtain economic value from the disclosure or use of the information. He then goes on to talk about why he believes this to be a problem and looks at all of the individual argumentative pieces that Nexon is making. Now, again, the alleged thing here is that Nexon says not only that trade secrets were taken, but provides examples of assets being taken with the same file names, talks about the artwork that has been taken, etc., etc. Now, I do want to say that this bit here, this piece was made before the response that was made by Iron Mace's artist, talking about all of the different things that are different about what it was that they had created. That being said, they do make some very, very good points in here. Nexon even went so far as to nearly quote that section of the law, saying that they took reasonable measures to maintain confidentiality of these source codes, art resources, and build files, and then goes on in detail to talk about how, upon discovery of Mr. Choi's misconduct, Nexon disciplined and terminated Mr. Choi from his position. So because of the way that the law is written, they made sure that they made mention of that very, very specific section in a very, very specific way, basically alluding to the fact that he stole from them their trade secrets. Well, according to Nexon, it's fact anyway. I think it's also important to note here that when it comes to civil cases like DMCA and copyright claims, there doesn't have to be the whole shadow of a doubt type of thing in the case of like criminal court, right? In the case of criminal court, there just needs to be like a single person on the jury that would doubt that the person was guilty. And then in which case it would become a hung jury. The vote has to be unanimous in order to be able to convict someone of a crime. In the case of a civil matter like this one, that is not the case. They only have to do better than half. In this case, it's like a majority rule kind of thing. Someone, a judge, whatever, would have to say that it was more to the side of having stolen things than not in order to be able to give a verdict to Nexon or to Iron Mace. It doesn't have to be a perfect solution answer where Nexon is all the way right. At this point, I think it's important to note that in the case of criminal court versus civil court, there's a difference of how these verdicts come to be. In criminal court, it has to be a unanimous decision by a jury of your peers in order to be able to find someone guilty, and it's innocent until proven guilty, right? In civil court, it doesn't have to be that way. When judgments are determined, it just has to be more weighted heavily toward one side or the other. Now, a judge or jury, whatever, could end up determining that in this civil proceeding that Nexon isn't all the way right in the things that they end up alleging, but they just have to be more right in their stance than what Iron Mace is in order to be able to win. They just have to be a little bit over 50% in their correctness, if you want to put it that way. Now, of course, how much more correct they are could also determine how the judgment would be settled, but I digress. Now, unfortunately, this next section here does end up being a little bit damning. See, they look at the asset, right? The assets that Nexon says were stolen, right? Copied verbatim, 1,000, 2,000, whatever file names. And the argument here is that Project P3 and Iron Mace's games Dark and Darker are so similar that they even go right down to thousands of different files that all have the same names. Now, of course, the rebuttal from Iron Mace is that, well, they were all store-bought assets. We just bought them off the shelf. However, because process in this case and inside information, trade secrets is really what's at question here. The person that talks about this looks at it and says, okay, well, couldn't they have just used different assets? And then provides additional screen caps saying that, well, there's a lot of different dungeon assets that could potentially have been utilized in order to be able to build whatever dungeons these people were looking to build. There's a lot of different asset packs that they could have looked into and built this game with instead, but they didn't. They used the same asset packs that they had been using at Project P3, I'm guessing because they were familiar. So it's not so much that the assets were off the shelf from Walmart, it's that there were a lot of other options to be able to choose from where they could have made a game that functioned but didn't necessarily look the same and wouldn't necessarily have had the exact same files or definitely not the exact same character models. And none of this is about whether or not I believe that Iron Mace is wrong or right. I would like to see Iron Mace prevail in this, if only because I think that it would get to the market a little bit faster and would allow us to be able to enjoy it all that much more. However, they still have a battle in front of them. In fact, if we look at this option, for example, there is this skeleton that was searched, and there's a lot of different options for skeletons. They didn't necessarily have to use the exact same pack that they had been using all along. Now, again, this person goes into the concept art in the next section here, and in doing so talks about how the character models are very, very similar, and then does Google searches, etc., etc. In this case, though, again, this was a couple of days or a day before the concept artist for Dark and Darker ended up making their detailed response talking about the differences in the artwork. I would personally like to believe that the concept artist knows what they're talking about and understands the assignment, so to speak, and has a good defensive position in the case of how they made the artwork the way that they made it. But for the purpose of arguing this to a jury, let's say, this doesn't look that great. I do, however, believe that any talented legal team would have the ability to be able to argue this either way. And I think in this case, it's really going to come down to how good the litigators are. The most damning piece of, I guess, evidence that Nexon has in their favor is the key concept of the game. Now, unfortunately, Nexon did a really poor job of this, which is something that this person ends up also agreeing with me on that, where they describe the game as being this darkly lit dungeon where you need a torch and there's dark bricks and all this other stuff, which almost sounds laughable because it describes a million different scenarios with stuff like that. However, one thing that I believe that they did not do a good enough job here in their analysis is talking about the key concept of the game and being able to find a related game that has something to do with Dark and Darker's gameplay. Now, in this, Iron Mace points to Expedition Agartha, but Expedition Agartha began their development processes after that of Iron Mace games, at least insofar as people's public knowledge of it anyway. He then goes on to pontificate on the following. The point is to say that at the time Dark and Darker began development, it appears that the only game substantially similar to it, there's those words substantially similar again, was the yet unreleased P3. While Nexon did announce P3 in 2021, at no point was anything about P3 explained. It was simply described as a project under development with a single screenshot provided. Oof. Now that sounds pretty damning. However, there is a counterpoint to this that I want to make mention of, because Iron Mace's position in this is that the idea of a hack-and-slash dungeon crawler with player versus player and player versus enemy or environment elements is not something that should be all that difficult to think of, whereas Nexon's position is, well, no one thought of it until you were working for us. That actually isn't true. And I don't mean Morrowind. Sure, there's the player versus enemy or player versus environment aspects of Morrowind that are very similar with being able to turn off torches on walls and hack away at skeletons and whatnot. No, what I mean is this game. This is the random dungeon mod for Chivalry's Medieval Warfare that was brought to the marketplace, the workshop, in October of 2015, almost 8 years ago. It's 7.5 years old. And this is what the gameplay looks like. If you notice, the person that's running around with the spear right now is a skeleton. He's a red skeleton. He has a red skeleton character model that you have the option to be able to use should you so choose. In this, there's a set of 10 players that are running around on a map. You have the ability to fight other players. You can loot all kinds of things. You have the ability to fight a bunch of skeletons. You can summon bosses. There are obviously darkly lit rooms. There's torches involved. And the combat is all based on the hack and slash mechanics that Torn Banner is famous for. It would be almost ludicrous to think that a company like Dark and Darker's devs, or Iron Mace Games, or the people working at Nexon at the time were not familiar with this game, having made a game that looks and feels very, very similar. Yet, Torn Banner, as far as I'm aware, has no history of levying copyright strikes or claims against anyone for their hack and slash mechanics. I think the argumentative point of the idea of the game is actually a weak one. I don't believe that to be a strong position for them. The strongest position that Nexon has would be to prove that in the course of the employees working for them, the process that they were following was so close to the process that they followed at P3 that it's too close, too similar to not be considered a trade secret. The person that wrote this post even goes on to say that Iron Mace didn't learn anything from Nexon illegitimately, which I believe to be true. They learned them in the case of their employment, however, meaning that Nexon owned the stuff that they were discovering because they were employed to discover and build what they were building. If they then left and did the same exact thing with what they were discovering and building, or had already discovered and built upon what Nexon was paying them to do, that's when it starts getting really fishy and wishy-washy. And in reality, the guys that were employed at Nexon, when they were employed at Nexon, especially the key employee, Mr. Choi, was basically slated with the duty of coming up with a video game that Nexon could market. That was his entire job. He was the creative person behind Project P3 and was making a game after he was terminated outside of Nexon that looked and felt, I guess, so close to what Nexon had paid him to create that they only felt it pertinent to lay suit. Now again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not somebody trying to pass judgment. I'm not saying whether or not Iron Mace is guilty or innocent. I'm only looking at the merits of what it was that they provided and showing different options and things that I've been discovering along the way. In my mind, the concept of utilizing what you remembered from 7 years ago, let's say, from a Chivalry mod, that it's very, very likely that people ended up playing from this dev team, and it's likely that SDF ended up playing it given that he's such a huge fan of hack and slash games and he's such a D&D nerd. I couldn't see a scenario where he wouldn't have delved into a game like that. It's almost a carbon copy of what it was that they're creating over at Iron Mace. Now, whether or not that is something that they brought into Project P3 with them, and that's where the idea kind of came from, or whether or not this was something that was literally cooked up in a studio by those guys, I don't know. And I don't know whether or not the copyright folks in U.S. Copyright Court will end up finding them in violation of it. Now, this is, of course, in the case that the DMCA claim ends up actually seeing court. It's very possible that Iron Mace, in their dispute, ends up having Nexon
Nem is értem, amit írsz, Dodi.
drop the ball, although I can't see a scenario where that ends up actually happening. There's about a 2-week period between now and, I guess, 2 weeks from now, where Nexon has the ability to respond to the dispute that Iron Mace probably has levied by now, which means that we're not going to see the DMCA get rescinded from Iron Mace's game, from Dark and Darker, for at least a couple of weeks. If Nexon ends up filing a suit in court against Iron Mace, a formal one in court in the United States somewhere, this is not going to see the light of day.
De ezt nem értem, Dodi, itt most nincsen ilyen, hogy ezt ki, hogy mit csinált.
Until after the court case has been figured out.
Ebben a videóban legalábbis nem erről van szó.
Copyright issue. That's why the Steam delisting happened. That's the court case going on between the two companies. Now, there was a cease and desist letter that was sent from Nexon to the folks at Iron Mace telling them to not make the game anymore, but that, as far as I'm aware, was...
Na jó, de ebben a videóban, vagy legalábbis már itt nem merem semmire azt mondani, hogy így meg úgy van. De ebben a videóban az derül ki, hogy állítólag ez az egész szituációt az amerikai törvények szerint kell lejátszaniuk.
not actually sent to them from a
Nem
Korean
akarok jól
court.
belemenni,
It was
mert
just
inkább,
them saying like,
hogyha
hey, if you
valaki
keep
izé
doing
van,
this,
az
we're
nézze
going to
meg a
take you to
videót.
court. Now, whether or not Iron Mace is obliging, I have no idea. They're not saying. Which moves us into this last piece. This is a change log from the SteamDB website. We ended up taking some screen caps just so that you guys could see it would make it a little bit easier. But this is a change to the Dark and Darker application, which is called dungeoncrawler.exe. That's kind of like their project name is Dungeon Crawler, where they add this little
De az a
extension
játékhoz,
onto it
ahhoz
of
nincs kötve a
Steam
játékhoz.
equals 1. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. It's usually
Vagy
something
legalábbis
having
szerintem
to
annak
do
nincs
with
köze.
the server
Nem,
hosting and the type of server
azt
that it
tudja, más
is
sem mondani.
for the game, and allows certain functionalities to happen inside of a game like Dark and Darker when Dark and Darker is running.
Hát
And what's
itt a
interesting about
videóban
this is they added it
én
to
már
the
nem merem
launch
azt mondani, hogy így
argument.
van, mert
So
mindig
when
belekötött valaki
you,
múltkor is. De
hit
a videóban
play
el
on
van
a
mondva,
game
hogy
on
ez így
Steam,
van.
the executable goes through a series of events. One of them is to ping a server or a series of servers that have to do with things like anti-cheat, have to do with things like logging in for player profiles, those kinds of things. And those happen kind of like at the start, right? Like you're going to ping servers before you actually end up like building the world that you're logging into, because you have to make sure that everything is functional. Now, in this case, what we're looking at is an IP address and this command for D3D11. Now, D3D11 is Direct 3D and DirectX 11. Basically forcing the game to run in DX11 and not any other form of DirectX, although some games allow you to opt in for things like Vulkan or DX12, blah, blah, blah. This looks almost exactly the same as what happened back in February a few days into the playtest for February's playtest when they did the demo of them changing things to server IP addresses for D3D11 again, Dark and Darker with DX11, dungeoncrawler.exe, but you can see that the server IP is the exact same. And the server, if you track it down on a website, is this one. It's located at a farm at AWS, located in Portland, Oregon. It's an Amazon web hosting server. The belief is that server is serving like profile logins of some kind. There's a bunch of different options. I had the opportunity to speak with a very well-regarded head of studio for a very well.
De az a lényeg, a játéknak ami a játékító, neked is szép.
But there's a couple of interesting takeaways with this. The first is when I was speaking with them, the initial like knee-jerk reaction was like, wow, why would they change something? Anytime we've ever had to deal with stuff like this, whether we're making a DMCA claim or otherwise, everything that we've ever seen with this kind of stuff is don't change anything with the game. Nothing. Don't change a damn thing until you check with us first. The other thought was it's potentially something that was queued up in advance, right? Like you're getting ready for the playtest on the 14th, for instance, and you have like a certain workflow and you like automate a certain process and that's queued up in advance and you set that to go. But it's so far before the playtest, the next playtest is supposed to even take place, that the likelihood of that being a thing is very slim to none. The next option is there could have been a modification to something on Steam's backend where certain parameters had to be modified in order for the way that everything functioned or the way that it was listed to be able to stay working. And they had to add that blurb at the end for Steam equals 1 onto it. And I'm sure that somebody in the comments that's a game dev or otherwise probably recognizes whatever the heck that thing means and is likely going to be able to end up saying something in the comments as to what that thing's all about. But as far as me, I don't really know. I don't work in this space. I'm really just going by what I can do with my own Google foo. You know what I mean? Now, of course, the last argument here is that they're setting something up because they still plan on having the playtest happen at a certain point in time. Or it's possible that they're looking to try and migrate stuff away and put stuff into their own launcher and end up hitting AWS and serving the game that way, however they're able to. But using Steam's matchmaking services, which is what these servers look like it's for, is matchmaking and profile checking and logging in. Steam would not be happy about that if they were to ping Steam's servers.
Abból is azért elmondja, hogy nagyon sok olyan dolog van, amit nem tudunk, és hogy emiatt ő is csak reálisan próbálja, ahogy kb. Dodi is elmondta ezeket a dolgokat, körüljárni, nem tudom. Úgyhogy nehéz ezt úgy. Nehéz úgy erről beszélni, hogy nem tudunk dolgokat, amik nagyon fontosak lennek.
It's just a question as like, why would you do that if you're pending a copyright claim discussion? Because they're going to end up having to go in and look at all of those little iterative changes that you made since the date of the DMCA claim. Anyway, guys, that's what I have for this one. That's the story. For more news and information,
hol volt?
and the way that it's determined on Steam's marketplace because the marketplace that is offering it up for sale is in the United States. And we talk about this stuff, right? Okay, so first, when people talk about the lawsuits between Nexon and Iron Mace, there's only two suits, actually. People think that there are a pair of suits in Korea that have to do with the DMCA claim in the United States and a separate lawsuit in Korea against Iron Mace for this whole trade secret thing. That actually isn't true. There are two lawsuits, but the one in Korea, at least insofar as right now, is a personal one between Nexon and this Mr. Choi, the person that was the creative director, the guy in charge of the team making Project P3 over at Nexon. When they left, that's when the lawsuit proceedings began, and Nexon just sued or accused Mr. Choi of all of this stuff. Now, that is a criminal matter in Korea, and we don't know whenever that's going to happen. But in Korea, there is no lawsuit, at least as far as I know, right now, between Nexon and Iron Mace. And I think that's an important distinction because the company versus company stuff is only going on in the United States, and it's about United States copyright law. See, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA, is a U.S. law. That means that if you're going to invoke a U.S. law, you have to litigate it in the United States per United States laws. So when it comes to violating trade secrets and all of that stuff doesn't have anything to do with Korea insofar as whether or not Iron Mace can continue to make their game. It's whether or not they can actually do anything with the stuff that they've made already in the US on Steam's marketplace because the marketplace that is offering it up for sale is in the United States, and they invoked United States copyright law in order to get them to stop. There is also a cease and desist letter that has been sent to Iron Mace telling them that they need to stop creating their game. But that cease and desist, that C&D, as far as I am aware, is one where Nexon threatened suit. They didn't actually get a court order from any court anywhere to enforce that and tell them that they must stop. So again, there isn't anything in...
Igen, ebben a részben, vagy ebben a részben, a videónak ebben a részében, igen, de utána a többi része viszont az kicsit yikes megint. Mármint, hogyha az esélyeket nézzük. De erre én is azt mondtam, hogy ez az elég sok mindent megváltoztat. De ugye itt az ember, aki Redditen megint a Reddit szakértők, akik összeszedték a dolgokat, az kicsit azt mondja, hogy ettől függetlenül még mindig nem rózsás a szituáció, de azért ez megint sok mindent megváltoztat, hogyha tényleg így van. De hát majd kiderül, ugye, folyamatosan más van. Ja. Na várjál, közben nézzük, hogy lejött ez. Ja, le. Akkor mehet is a horror. Na mindjárt. De hát valószínűleg folyamatosan ki fognak derülni dolgok, és úgy is meglátjuk, hogy mi lesz ennek a folytatása.